So I'll stop there, Nick.
All right, Jim, thank you, and thanks to all three of our panelists for providing some, I think, some incredible perspective and education and suggestions for how we may proceed. As I was listening, it strikes me that time and again, when we have these reforms that are enacted, inevitably they run into the courts. And the court has something else to say, which it seems to me can work at cross purposes, often to this idea of trying to limit the big money that flows into politics. I just don't, to me, that seems a hurdle that we can't get over. If inevitably you're going to run into a court, ideologically the makeup may be such that that it rules against the very thing that you're trying to achieve. So is it just crafting the legislation in a way that stands up to scrutiny better, or is it a problem that is without a solution?
Go ahead.
I'm a lawyer, so let me take a first crack at that.
Oh, no, it'll go on forever.
Yes, it will. No, the basic problem is that it's true that people do, on a reflex, run in and challenge any attempts at campaign finance reform in the courts these days. That is a strategy developed basically by right-wing people to try and prevent there from being any kind of campaign finance limits. But the problem is not just crafting legislation. The fundamental problem is this. Until the Citizens United decision, and the other decisions in that line since 2007, the Supreme Court said there were two permissible bases on which legislatures could regulate campaign finances and limit donations and try and limit the transfer of power from economic elites over onto the political side and distort our democracy that way. One of those rationales has always been, well, you can certainly limit them by prohibiting outright bribery. So you can bar, it's not legal for a contributor to say, okay, you, Jim, if you get elected, I want you to pass a tax rebate for my property parcel, and you have to agree to that. That, however, has always been illegal as bribery under the criminal laws. We don't really need campaign finance reform for that purpose, the anti-fraud purpose. Okay, but it is one of the two rationales the courts traditionally cited in considering whether or not legislators could permissibly impose limits on campaign donations and expenditures. The second rationale historically, and actually the more important one when all this started back in the progressive era really, was that we wanted to essentially put up a dike to say that people who had great economic resources could not use that to distort our democracy and to undermine the principle of one person, one vote. Not $1, one vote, but one person, one vote. In the Citizens United case, the most important thing, in my opinion, the Supreme Court did, was they said this rationale of the legislature being entitled to impose limits to try and keep power from migrating from the economic sector into the political sector, that's not a legitimate rationale anymore. Even though they had recently affirmed it, in a 1991 Supreme Court decision. So now the legislature, the only permissible grounds on which a legislature can impose any kind of campaign limits is under an anti-fraud rationale. And the Supreme Court has interpreted fraud extremely narrowly, and much more narrowly than, say, the Founding Fathers did. And if you want to see, there's a couple of good books on this. There's a book called Republic Lost by Larry Lessig. There's a book by Zephyr Teachout about corruption in America that talks about this at great length.
And of course, that ignores the practical effect, which is he who writes the biggest check gets the most access.
Well, and there's a number of very interesting political cartoons I could show you to exactly that effect. And it's true. The Supreme Court decision in Citizens United basically bars us from adopting this sort of leveling the playing field rationale, which was an important rationale for the initial adoption of campaign finance limits. They don't believe that rich people shouldn't have an outsized say. Basically, there's a 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court at the moment that doesn't believe that. And they've not only expressed that opinion, but they've put it into the law by saying it's a constitutional right under the First Amendment. So the legislature can't get around it, even if they disagree with the Supreme Court, which is unlike many Supreme Court decisions where the legislature has the final say because they can always pass legislation to essentially do something different than what the court had ruled in the case. So that is why Citizens United is so pernicious, and why so many people have sort of thrown up their hands saying this is hopeless. We don't even try anymore. Now, the fallacy in that is this. It is true that Citizens United does impose great limits on what can be done by imposing mandatory limits on candidates. But the place where Citizens United does not really restrict us is where we create voluntary systems that a candidate has to opt into voluntarily. When you have those types of voluntary systems, as you have in, say, a small donor matching system, then you can impose the same kinds of limits that we all think should be imposed on the size of donations that people can accept, the types of businesses that can accept them from, and so on, because it's voluntary rather than being mandated by the legislature. So Citizens United does not block us from adopting those kinds of reforms. Now, the one thing Citizens United does do, and the First Amendment really does this, is it does prevent us from saying, you, Bruce Rauner or J.B. Pritzker, you can't use unlimited amounts of your own funds to run for office, which they do in some countries. So we can't ever prevent super rich people from using their own funds to run for political office. But what we can do is dilute that, because we collectively as a public still have much more resources than any of the billionaires in terms of being able to provide them to candidates if we get together and cooperatively fund those races. So as I said, so that those candidates are more accountable to the general public than they are to just a few big donors.
Let me add on to that, and I don't know the detail, and David may, but I would add that in a couple of states where there is small donor matching, that most candidates will adhere to the small donor limits, because if they don't, they may be branded as somebody who's trying to buy the election. So it doesn't stop somebody from doing that, but it has that kind of effect. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the best case study for this is one of the places where one of the longest living of these systems has existed and has been through various tests. And that's New York City uses a small donor matching system for their municipal election. So the mayor and all the city council members have the option to participate in a small donor matching system. And about 70 to 80% of the candidates do. But you get outliers like a Michael Bloomberg, who's a billionaire. Okay, Michael Bloomberg, there were the limits imposed about people who participated in a small donor matching system were that they could spend about $7 million on their general campaign and $7 million on their primary.
That high.
They were. But Michael Bloomberg spent about $100 million. So he outspent them all by more than 10 to 1. Now, his opponent, with that $7 million, his Republican opponent, was still managed to run a competitive campaign. It was enough for him to get his message out and to communicate with voters. And it was still a competitive race. It was like 45, 55 or something like that. But it was a real race. So even though you had that large imbalance, the challenger had enough money to still run an effective campaign. And that's what the New York City system has shown. It has shown, there has been this effect of people who don't participate in the system get asked, why are you siding with big donors? And typically in municipal elections, that means real estate developers, rather than the general public. So it does have that salutary effect as well. And there are also some case studies, because they do a post-mortem after every election, their finance board. And what it shows is basically that as long as the candidates have access to enough money to get their message out, even if they can't match the big spenders or the super rich dollar for dollar, they can still run competitive campaigns, and it makes money much less a determinant of who wins and who loses. So it's a much more of a leveling of the playing field, essentially. So it has had those effects in the
Randy,
community.
you got some comments, go ahead.
Yeah, just real quick, and I think we can't let ourselves off the hook. So we were talking about this increase in negativity, although I always go back to Johnson's ad against Goldberg. Goldwater, sorry, when we talk about negativity.
Which never ran.
No, it
aired
ran once.
Once, that's right.
Once, but everybody who saw it remembered it.
It got picked up though.
Yeah, everybody who saw it remembered it. But here's the thing, political science research shows that the reason that candidates go negative is because of you,
It works.
because you remember negative advertisements.
Yeah.
And when we poll people and say, why did you vote for this candidate? Or people will word for word parrot the negative ads that they have heard. Well, she is a, or he is a, and we heard this. And so part of what we have to do is we have to be good consumers. I tape almost everything on TV. I cannot stand campaign ads. And I fast forward over them, so I don't see most of them. But again, it goes back to us. This is our democracy. We have to hold people accountable. And if you think that there's truth in advertising when it comes to political campaigns, now one of the big trends is that they will cut an ad. And the ad will just be replicated all over the state, all over the country. So you are seeing an ad that you think is being created by a local politician that's targeting, something he's done or his opponent hasn't done or whatever it may be. But really, it's just a cookie cutter ad that you can see aired all over the country. Just insert a different name and insert, a different topic, and all of a sudden you've got the same ad that's going on. There's no truth in advertising when it comes to political ads. So if you're using that for your basis of decision, you're contributing to this problem, because as long as big money and negative ads are going to influence you, they're going to continue to do it. So we know that we say we hate negative advertisements, but the reality is we use them, and they know that.
Yes, and I have to say that some of the cutting edge work that's being done with voice and image manipulation is absolutely hair-raising. There is software available now where an actor can sit in a studio and can say words that will come out of a candidate's mouth that the candidate never speaks, never spoke, never would speak. But they have a way of doing it in such fashion that it's indistinguishable unless you're an expert and have the time to break down the frames to see how it's done. So we're headed for a whole brave new world, I think, in the future. If we thought we had seen fake news and websites that have popped up that have been, putting out garbage just in wait, we're going to have, it's going to take even more diligence on our part as time goes by. Speaking of time, we want to get to questions as much as we can. I'm sure you have them, so let me open the floor right now to anyone who's got a question to address to the panel. Roy?
Any idea how home rule relates to money in politics?
I can take this one because I've actually had to research this recently.
Home rule, okay.
There is a school of thought within some people in some of the government agencies that elections are not subject to home rule. They're excluded because they don't fall within the confines of home rule powers under Section 6 of the Illinois Constitution. I believe those people are wrong. They're relying on 1970s cases that were passed very shortly after the Constitutional Convention where we adopted home rule. And since then, the Illinois Supreme Court has dramatically changed the way it interprets the scope of home rule powers and has dramatically expanded, essentially, the scope of home rule powers. I believe that that home rule units do have the power to independently adopt things like their own campaign finance systems, as long as for home rule units, they don't have to necessarily be consistent with the other state law. But as long as they don't interfere with the general scheduling and general rules about running campaigns, they could adopt things like small donor matching systems for their own localities.
Nick, is Princeton a home rule city?
No.
Okay, well then some of you may not appreciate that home rule means the giving of a large degree of independence to local, in this case municipalities, to act on their own without going to the state legislature. And I just mentioned that because it might not be familiar to everybody.
No, that's right. It's basically, it's units of government, municipalities over 25,000.
But you could adopt it if you're smaller.
You can.
Yeah.
Yes, because Utica has home rule,
Oh, does it?
and that's utilized in areas outside the city limits that get into townships and counties and other governmental units.
Steve?
The small donation group that you say people tend to opt into, if only for the optics of their campaign, are they in fact funded by people's individual contributions, or are they in fact taking public money from the legislature?
Okay. The way they work is basically as follows. Once you have, as a candidate, once you have raised a certain number of small donations, which is defined how much that is, but let's say it's donations up to $150. Okay? When you've raised a certain number of them to prove that you're a serious candidate and not just a wingnut, then you qualify, and then what happens is, as you get donations from private individuals, qualified voters in your jurisdiction for like $150, those are matched. And usually they're matched at a multiple, so they may be matched at 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 with public funds that come out of the general public treasuries of whatever the jurisdiction is.
So what states actually have that, rather than municipal?
Arizona has a system like this. North Carolina used to, before the Republicans took control of that state. They had one for the judicial elections. They've done away with it after the Republicans took control of the state. But about 13 other municipalities around the country have it, so that New York City, well, most of the big cities in the country have some form of it. Chicago recently had a public referendum, and about 80%, it was advisory, it wasn't mandatory, but 80% of the people voted in favor of adopting such a system. The city council in Chicago still hasn't gotten around to it, but that's another story. But cities like Los Angeles, Houston, Albuquerque, San Francisco, Seattle has a new voucher system, which is a slightly different form of public financing that they've adopted. But there are 12 or 13 cities around the country that have adopted, and there are 2 or 3 states. Maine is another state that has a public financing system for the statewide elections. They have what they call a clean money system, where they simply give you essentially a block grant once you prove that you have serious public support, that you're a serious candidate. And that's another form of public financing.
Or legislators and statewide candidates?
I know they have it for governor, and I think they have it for legislators in Maine. In Maryland, they have it for the governor's race. I don't think they have it for the legislative races.
And so what was the proposal that you, the campaign for political reform got through the Senate but stalled?
It was a system modeled basically on the New York City system, so that donations, once you'd raise a certain number of small donations to qualify, you would get those donations matched at a 6-to-1 ratio up to a certain cap. And these programs also generally impose caps to limit the exposure of the public dollars. So they say, okay, you can spend up to this amount of money, and we'll match up to that point. You can have an open and closed system, so that an open system is one where you can continue to raise money beyond that and spend it. You can have a closed system, which actually you all know about. We had, and it worked very successfully in this country for 20 years for the President of the United States. It was adopted as part of the 1970 amendments. And presidential elections from the 1970s up through the 1990s, in the general election, were almost all funded with public funds. So once the candidates got the nomination, they agreed to accept public funds and limits. And they got those, they agreed to accept public funds. They got the money from the federal government.
Yeah.
And
Was that the checkoff on the income tax?
that was the checkoff on the income tax. And they were barred from raising additional money beyond that. So such communists as Ronald Reagan and others were elected using those funds. And it does make a dramatic difference in one very important respect that I would point out, which is Ronald Reagan, when he ran for his second term, he held about three or four fundraisers that year, as opposed to the roughly 300 or so that Barack Obama attended in connection with his second election. The reason the presidential system fell apart was simply because Congress failed to essentially index it for inflation and update it as appropriate. So that eventually, with the increase in cost of campaigns, candidates decided it was more to their advantage to opt out of the system than to be limited to the amount of money they could get under the federal system. And that's the only reason it fell apart. But it worked quite well for 20 years.
Is it still available to
It
candidates?
is still available.
Yeah.
Yes.
One of the things that's interested me is how it's done in other countries. Is there any other country or countries we could learn from, both in terms of how they govern their spending and how they conduct the campaigns? We've talked about shorter campaigns. We've talked about putting limits on the amount spent. Who does what? Any examples that you folks have?
Well, I started with the British example, right? So I mean, the interesting thing about the British is that the British sort of have the kind of excitement that Americans have about politics, but they compacted into, they have two different elections, they have a short and a long, and it depends on the planning and when the elections are called for. But yeah, they have very serious limits on the amount of money that can be spent. In the last election cycle, you had these political parties that were popping up, these right-wing parties that were receiving huge donations. They couldn't spend the money because they ran out of legal ways in which to spend it. So they had this idle money, if you will, just sort of sitting by. So yeah, you shorten the election time period, England basically eliminates all of the campaign advertisements on television. There's some purchasing of billboards, etc. But one of the things you have to keep in mind, though, is that I think part of the problem with money, and I'm going to switch over to Congress for a second, is that we refuse to increase the size of Congress. And so every year, the size of these congressional districts get bigger. Every 10 years, we redistrict these because we refuse to expand it. So now you're about 670,000 people per every legislative district. And that means a lot more people that you've got to reach out to, a lot more people that you've got to appeal to, and that means a lot more money. England has 650 districts, and they're a fraction of the size of us. And so it's so much more easier for candidates to go knocking on doors in a much more compact geographic district than it is when you're trying to cover, look at the 16th congressional district from Wisconsin to Indiana, or some of these other downstate districts that run 3.5 hours from top to bottom of the district. So I think part of the way in which you might be able to address some of this would be to have reasonable increases on Congress, because when we capped the number at 435, 90 years ago, that originally the legislative districts were one per every 15,000. Now keep in mind, of course, we have mass communications and mass transportation, so nobody's expecting it to be that small, but you have, especially for the House, these people get elected and they start running for office. They get about a 6-month window, maybe, breather, and then they've got to start running for office again in these massive districts. So I think if you shorten the length of time that you had the primary season, if you put, limits on spending, which are going to be more problematic, but if you tried to carve up these districts even more so that people could be, the House at least could be more what it was supposed to be, which is representative of a population of people that were relatively similar, who had close contact with their member of Congress. Not only could you affect money, but you could affect the way in which those people represent us.
Amanda, am I correct that in the United Kingdom, most contributions go to the political party?
Correct.
And the party spends in behalf of the candidates. Candidates can raise a tiny amount of money.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. So it gets back to my point about what I think of as the value of political parties, and that they're not perfect.
Right, and they're much more important in a parliamentary system like in Britain, where who gets elected is determined by the party, where you are on the party list, basically.
Yeah.
But to answer your original question, there are, as Amanda said, there are some things that we could learn from, but we have two real problems in trying to look to other countries for suggestions. Number one, our First Amendment is interpreted by our courts as being unique in terms of the limits it poses on what kinds of, what the legislature can limit in terms of contributions or speech.
And speech would include advertising.
It absolutely includes advertising, yes. And the other thing is, while there are other good practical things that we could learn from other countries, for the most part, none of them have really solved the problem of the basic fact that Jim mentioned. The money follows the power. even though they have different systems, you will find if you dig deeply into them in any country of any size that the money finds a way into influencing the politicians. So nobody has perfected a good system for this.
Who else? Rick?
Couple questions. With all the accusations about fake news and lying and truthiness and so on, what's the difference between, I know the difference between slander and libel, but what about fraud and money and fraud? When you think about the outright lies that are thrown around, how come nobody's ever been accused of or...
They have been. The courts generally throw them out because that's a core First Amendment issue. And all the way back to the beginning of the Republic, people were saying pretty outrageous things, even among the Founding Fathers.
Right.
And basically courts say, take a hands-off approach on that, saying, we're not going to try and get in and regulate the truth of campaign promises or campaign statements. That is up to the general public. That's their responsibility to regulate that. Because once you start going down that road of saying the court is going to decide whether or not you're liable for a false promise,
Right.
you get on a very slippery slope very quickly about the courts basically censoring candidates and controlling the political dialogue, and that's why the courts aren't willing to go there.
Okay, my second question is, we give all this money, we talk about you can raise money and only give so much money. What are the controls on money for candidates who lose or parties who lose? How free are they to spend money just to go out and advocate for the same causes they advocated but lost over? And how long can they keep it? What can they do and not do?
Well, and then there's variations, and of course this goes back to the times, place, and mannerism clause, and there's variations on that, but it depends on where the money is coming from and to some degree what the state laws are. So one of the problems that Illinois had, and I was going to jump in when you were talking about Rod Blagojevich, before you had any reforms in place, is remember that Blagojevich actually funded his defense out of political campaign contributions.
What did you think about it?
Well, until 2000, Illinois legislatures, when they retired, could take and pocket that money, any money that was left in there. That was changed as a reform around 2000 in Illinois. But as Amanda said, it varies from state to state as to what state politicians can do with money remaining in their accounts. And the same thing at the federal level, there are some limits, but there are plenty of politicians who have managed to turn it into making a living. For instance, I think one of the film clips you showed mentioned the fact that people like Newt Gingrich and Sarah Palin have used the money to essentially live on and fund their continuing public presence.
Steve?
How realistic is it to look forward to later primaries, thus shorter general elections, when in presidential years the whole impetus is to have earlier primaries?
Well, the whole reason for having earlier primaries is money in politics. I mean, the reason everybody wants to back their primaries up is because if you have one of the first primaries or caucuses in this country, then more people are going to show up in your state, more people are going to spend money, and you're going to make piles of money off of it. So if you limited that and you had a very shorter period of time, you would also prevent that. And at the same time, you would promote the democratic process in primaries. I think people would turn out in greater numbers because primary system goes on for so long. Oftentimes a candidate emerges pretty early. I mean, some of the reforms that have been put in place by the parties, the Democrats did this a long time ago, getting rid of the winner-take-all system helps this. But once a candidate emerges as a pretty clear winner, people stop coming to the state, they stop spending money. So that's why everybody's backing it up. So shorter period would mean you really might actually have some control on that.
I'm not disagreeing with that, and I think it's a good idea. My point only is, everybody wants to get an earlier primary in presidential years so they'll have a bigger say in the outcome.
Right.
And how do you fight that?
That's true, but to argue the counter side of this, the reason for the gap in between primaries and general elections is generally a judgment call. How much time do you need to run a general campaign to permit the candidates to really run a real campaign? That's the real issue. If you squish them too closely together, you run the risk of more untoward things happening because you don't have as long a general campaign to vet the candidate that comes out of the primary process, basically.
That gets us back to parties. In England, the long campaign isn't so important because there the people would still rely more on the cue from what the political party says than what a member of parliament candidate says. Just one other observation. I think the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform is wonderful. They're the best guys and they have sharp people, as you can tell. But to get to the point about the state Senate passing a small donor match program, you have to keep in mind that it was easy for the senators to vote for it because they knew it was going absolutely nowhere.
That's absolutely, that is absolutely true,
Sure.
I want to, if I could get, just to touch on this, Rick hit on it, and it gets back to this whole idea of the advertising. I've spent my entire career in broadcasting, and I would get lynched by the people who run the sales departments, but if it were up to me, I would do away with every bit of private advertising on radio and television, because I don't think it serves any purpose in enhancing our understanding of the issues. It devolves into name calling.
Then, as you say, I guarantee you would be fired within 5 minutes.
Yes, I completely agree with you.
Miss Magazine did it.
But here's my question. Have there been any attempts to hold the purveyors of the ads, radio stations, television stations, print media, accountable for the content in any way of the ads?
No, generally, they cannot be held accountable for the content. There has been some progress made on trying to open up their books and records so the public at least gets a peek at who's funding these different commercials, because as Amanda said, there's a great amount now of dark money in the system, but you can sometimes discern where it's coming from. If you can get into the station's records to find out who was buying, you can usually trace it back to someone related to a campaign.
And is that, what about now with social media and the buys on Facebook?
Same
and
thing on
Twitter?
social media, and that's what the recent congressional hearings were about being able to open the records relating to those purchases more to public scrutiny and public disclosure.
And keep in mind that most of the money is being spent on television. I mean, that's where it's being spent, and these are profit-making corporations owned by other profit-making corporations, and oftentimes the issues that are being put out there directly benefit them. So the ads that are being run, they're not just, taking money to fund a candidate or get money to fund an issue outside of an election. They're actually taking money and then running this content, and it benefits them. I'll go way back here to the Telecommunications Act, right? Where you've got all of this is where we were going to adopt the digital spectrum, all this cable that you have and all these little channels, and the Telecommunications Act was basically a law that said, should we sell this public resource that's worth billions of dollars called the digital spectrum, or should we give it away to television stations and let them make piles of money off of it? And I remember the ads when they came out, Congress is trying to tax the airwaves. It was this misleading campaign. We know that the television corporations themselves were running the ads. There was no other voice funded on the other side, and Congress, with the President of the United States and a bipartisan support, signed over this piece of legislation that basically then just handed them the digital spectrum. People can't get upset about it because they don't know. So I think there should be some accountability, that there's some burden that television stations who make piles of money off these advertisements, if there is a distorting effect in what they're taking in, that they should somehow be accountable to that, to disclose that or to provide some access to the other side.
And there have been debates about equal time doctrines, but for the most part they've gone nowhere, in
Right.
part because of resistance from the industry itself.
Yeah.
But to answer your question about TV expenditures, TV expenditures are what have been driving the dramatic increases in cost that we've been seeing since the 1960s, since television really became an integral part of political campaigns. But you will see more and more of it going into the digital side. And I agree with Jim that the internet is a wonderful invention for being able to communicate more effectively with mass people. It's a revolutionary in that respect. But I don't share your optimism that it means that the people will take back the communication method. I think as we've seen in the last election, there are plenty of companies out there now that are staking out their territory, the digital territory, and they're using it to make money in the same way that TV stations make money the Facebooks, the Twitters, and so on, that sell ads, and they'll be getting an increasing portion of that advertising dollar. They have been in the most recent set of campaigns.
And they have algorithms to target, which you don't
Which
see
make
on
it even worse.
television, which
Right.
makes
Yeah.
it even
That's
worse.
true.
So you're seeing one ad on Facebook and you're seeing a different ad on Facebook and you don't even know that the other person's seeing the ad. I mean, I didn't know that Hillary Clinton was selling children out of a pizza parlor in New York City because I didn't see those ads on my Facebook feed, you know, but clearly other people did, so.
All of which has the tendency to pull us apart.
Yes.
Rather than bring us together. It's targeting. It's saying what you in your lifestyle like to hear. And I don't hear it, and I might not
Right.
agree with it, but it's, yeah, so.
Who else?
I'd like to ask a question about gerrymandering, but I don't know enough about how to form the question in what shape to ask about it. You know,
Well-
we know that gerrymandering is an issue. We've got stupid congressional districts that are designed, God knows how.
Usually to maximize one party's
Oh, yeah.
advantage or the other. Yeah.
So we have, in political science, we use these two terms, it's called cracking and packing, right?
Absolutely.
And when you draw district lines, you either pack people or you crack them. Packing means you put as many people of one party into a district, so yes, they're gonna win that district, but you only need 51% of the vote to win, you pack 87% of them into that district, that's all wasted vote, right? Cracking is the exact opposite, you split them up in so that their votes can't, you know, be out there. The interesting thing is that you've got some models. Iowa is using a GPS system, you know, that's trying to overlay a map. California has a bipartisan citizens panel. You know, the problem is that you can fix some of it, but you can't fix it all. Because there's a natural tendency for packing to occur, and particularly where large population centers are. So if you look at a city like Chicago, for example, if we used a GPS software system to do it, it would have to be really sophisticated, because one of the things we don't want to do is negatively impact minority voting. Right now, we create districts, they're called majority-minority districts, so that minorities have the ability to get representation. But the other thing is those funky lines could actually indicate that you're doing something good. So for Chicago, for example, all of the Democrats are in Chicago and the surrounding suburbs. I mean, that's where the Democratic population is. It's really hard not to draw weird lines so if you don't draw the weird lines, what you end up with naturally packed districts. And so downstate Republicans would then disproportionately be advantaged by the fact that we're not drawing those weird lines.
Well, historically, how was the process carried out?
Historically, well, gerrymandering goes back to the first elections during the congressional period and going on since then.
Yeah.
But what has changed is that with increasingly refined information that computers basically make possible, and with increasingly refined programs that computers make possible, you can now gerrymander to a much more exact degree than you could in the past. It's become much more of an art than it used to be because of the ability to use computers and modeling in doing it. Let me just add a couple things on gerrymandering. So, and Amanda's absolutely right. You can never take the politics entirely out of gerrymandering. But it is a good idea, in my opinion, to take it away from the legislators who are most directly affected by it. That's letting, you know, the foxes guard the hen house. I personally happen to believe, I support the effort that Change Illinois had tried to get on the ballot here for an independent commission type system that California's adopted, that Arizona uses, and a few other states, where you take it out of the hands of the politicians and you basically put it into the hands more of lay people or apolitical people to come together and to design those districts, taking a variety of factors into account that you have to.
I did not support it, and the reason that I won't support it is I won't support it until every state agrees to do
Yeah,
it.
and that
Because
is-
right now, there are only a handful of Democratic states that are being gerrymandered to benefit Democrats. And let me tell you, this isn't accidental. When Democrats were winning elections in the 1980s because they had popular support, Republicans said, we're going to spend money to target state legislative districts so that we can win there, and then we can gerrymander, ensuring that we will then win even when we don't have the votes to do so. So the vast majority of states right now are gerrymandered to benefit Republicans, and unless everybody adopts the system, and you adopt it here in Illinois, all you're doing is harming the Democratic Party more than what they're currently being harmed right now.
And I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
I am torn about the decision here to support it or not support it because of
In
that.
theory, I
In
support it.
theory,
but
in theory, I
practice,
support it, and I agree with you, hope that it should be countrywide so that everybody is affected.
Yep.
But you do get the system, the worst examples are the system of what occurred in Wisconsin, where they gerrymandered it intentionally and knowingly, so that even though the Republicans got less than a majority of the votes for the overall legislative races in the state, they ended up with 2/3 majority in the
I
legislature.
think it was a 2010 or 2012 election. I'm terrible with dates, which is why I teach history. But one of those elections, I think the Democrats nationwide had 2.6 million more votes in the House than
Yes.
Republicans did and still lost. And part of that is gerrymandering. Part of that is the fact that Democrats are disproportionately in states like California, they're disproportionately in states like Illinois, and some of that you can't get rid of. But, this is again, I go back to the times, place, and mannerism clause of the Constitution. If I could get rid of anything in the Constitution tomorrow, that's what I would get rid of, because it would
Which
solve.
one?
The one that says that states basically get to decide the time, place, and manner of elections, which we have taken to mean historically who gets to vote, how they get to vote,
Right,
what the
right,
districts
right.
look like, what the voting
Well,
registration
Congress
laws
does
are.
have the ability to override that
They do,
under the
correct.
Constitution,
They do, but they don't.
but they don't.
So,
That brings to mind that in terms of gerrymandering, you're going to be seeing more in the news about the U.S. Supreme Court and how it will decide related to gerrymandering. It'd be interesting to see what thoughtful people like David and Amanda think, but I worry, I would hope the court does not get involved, because if it does, there's going to be an absolutely endless quagmire of making fine decisions that go to the Supreme Court about whether a district has enough Latinos or whites or African Americans. It's going to be an endless, that's my worry.
And let me respond to that, because I have a different view.
Sure.
So I'm cautiously optimistic that Justice Kennedy will provide the fifth decisive vote to set a minimum floor beyond which you cannot you cannot play with the gerrymandering process. You cannot distort it beyond that point. So they'll set a floor and say, if the wasted votes amounts to this much, so that, for instance, parties can entrench themselves in power, like the Republicans in Wisconsin, who now, even though they get less than majority of the votes, they have a veto-proof majority in the legislature because of the way they've gerrymandered the state. That's not a democratic system anymore, in my opinion.
yeah.
So I think the Supreme Court there's a good chance they'll set a floor. They will be sensitive to they're not going to draw the lines in every district. So that's all it will be, is a floor. It will not
They're
reform.
almost doing that now.
Well, they have to do that under the Voting Rights Act for minority representation.
And they can't decide whether 60% African American helps the blacks or hurts
Well,
the
it's a
blacks.
very-
I mean, it's very complicated.
It's very complicated. It's an extremely
Well,
complicated area of law.
here's the thing, so political science has changed though, and here's where I'm gonna tout some of the stuff that they do. So they're looking at, the model that they hope they adopt is gonna be something called an outlier model, and that's the minimum standard. It's not gonna be one that says every district has to be this way or that way, but basically you can't create a district that lies outside of what would be the norm, right? So you can't distort it too much. And if they adopt that model, and it's more complicated math than NPR had a mathematician explaining it, and I was still going, I'm not sure I quite get it, but I get the general principle. If they adopt that model, I think it will be relatively simple, and that's the one that we're hoping for.
No, it
Well,
will be,
I-
no, it will be relatively, all it really does, and this is, in the last case that the court had about 10 years ago, Justice Kennedy said because there was not a reasonable standard that courts could use, he declined to find a plan unconstitutional. Now the social scientists have come back with various models
Right.
that are relatively simple. Basically, in the current model, all you're doing is you're taking the wasted votes in districts that Democrats won, and you're comparing them with the wasted votes where Republicans won, and vice versa in terms of where they're losing. And if there's a great imbalance there you're seeing the effects of this distortion created by gerrymandering.
Right.
And that is, it's a pretty straightforward mathematical, only requires regular arithmetic really, test, notwithstanding what Justice Roberts said during the oral arguments, where he was a little disingenuous in my opinion.
I think so, yeah.
So I think the Supreme Court will probably by a 5-4 majority, but it all depends on Justice Kennedy, say that there is a minimum standard. But that will not solve the gerrymandering problem. We still, as a public, need to address it by finding better ways to draw those boundaries. I happen to believe that an independent commission in states where you take the politicians out of it who are most directly affected is the best way to do it, but it's open for debate about how to do that.
And that's why the Democrats are focusing so much on about 7 governorships, which the Democrats think they can turn from Republican to Democrat, and that will reduce the imbalance in control of redistricting a bit toward Amanda's concern.
It will, because the Republicans benefited from a wave election in 2009 and 10, where they took over a great number of state legislators and then used their gerrymandering powers to essentially entrench themselves in power.
Larry, you had a question?
Well, yeah, except it's been partially answered. You know, if the gerrymandering algorithms are as sophisticated as what we're saying, couldn't that level of sophistication go a little bit further and actually craft a gerrymander, or I mean an apportionment system that would work? I suppose that's best addressed to a mathematician or statistician.
No, the answer is yes.
No, it can't be.
It can be, and there was a lot of testimony in the Wisconsin case in the trial record about just the extent to which the Republicans used model making and very sophisticated models to look at hundreds of different possible districting plans to find the one that was that gave them the most partisan advantage, basically. So you could do it to do the reverse, as you're suggesting, to eliminate the partisanship advantages.
And I think one of the other factors in Wisconsin was not as they did it all behind closed doors.
They did, yes.
It was very much out of the public.
Yes, and actually the person they used, the modeler they used from Oklahoma, has basically since said he was kind of disgusted by it and disowned it. That he didn't want to participate in anything anymore.
Another question, Barry, you had a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
A lot of times in discussions like this, term limits come up as a simple answer to a complicated problem. And I think Amanda has done research on that.
Oh, I have.
And so my question is, do term limits work?
No. I say that very, very flippantly, but understand that term limits have only been around since around, at the state legislative level. And, 1996, the Supreme Court overturned Arkansas's term limit plan. And for the state of Arkansas, they should be thankful, because if you try to do these things, just like the changes in gerrymandering on a state-by-state level, because Congress operates on a seniority system, if we were to just all of a sudden say we're going to term limit Illinois state legislatures, congressional representatives, we would just be, pardon the expression, but screwing ourselves out of any power in Congress. So Arkansas should thank the Supreme Court that they overturned them. But what we have is we have 15 states with term limits in place. We had 22, I think, as the most. Some of them have repealed them over the time. And the earliest ones are 2000. And they have different systems. Some of them are lifetime bans. Some of them are you wait out a little bit of time. But by and large, all of the big promises of term limits, it's going to end corruption in politics, it's going to decrease money, the power of lobbyists, you're going to elect more women and men when you term limit out the crusty old white guys, as I like to say. All that kind of stuff, it's really just not come to fruition, and in many cases what we see is actually bad things happening. What I say to my students is, would you fire every member of your company every 6 years?
Sure.
Where's your institutional memory, and where's the people who know how things function? And lobbyists have found a way. It has not at all addressed the problem of lobbying, and part of the problem is these people are hand selecting their successors. They're being term limited out. They say, well, here's somebody to run in my place. They're like cockroaches. You spray them out of one place, they move into another. Now, long term, we don't know, because and political scientists are still studying little pieces, and there are some pockets of sort of like, ooh, maybe it's good. But by and large, the answer to that question is no.
Let me join in on that. I don't have the benefit of doing all the studies, but the reason I'm opposed to term limits is, basically I say, we already have term limits, they're called elections.
Yep.
And the problem with term limits is you're simply then decreasing the accountability of the elected representatives. It's just going to make lobbyists and the behind-the-scenes funders more powerful. They'll be calling the shots, and they'll simply have replaceable parts in front of them.
So why
Yeah,
is
but
it so
I-
popular with the public then?
Because it's simple, because it attacks career politicians. It's playing the stereotypes in our minds, basically.
Yeah, but,
And we don't understand.
yeah, I go
That's part of the problem. We don't understand what all goes on.
I go back and forth on the issue, and I can see the arguments on each side. I think it's popular with the public, and I think I can understand this because it gives them some level of reassurance that there's going to be some turnover. And it has all of the problems that Amanda has noted, but I don't know that where they have it, things have gotten worse. I honestly don't know.
Yeah.
Actually, I could,
But I mean, would you eliminate the term limits on the presidency?
Well, no, but I think
No.
that's fundamentally very different.
I agree. I would not eliminate it on the presidency simply because that is such a heavy concentration of power.
Right.
I think that's wise. I think that's consistent with the founders' wisdom to spread the power out so that you don't have huge concentrations of power.
I see.
But I think voters are entitled to keep somebody if they're satisfied with them. And my real concern is if you go to a term limit system, what you'll end up with is something very much resembling the Tammany Hall system that they used to have in New York, where you have a boss creed running things behind the scenes, paying for the campaigns, picking the candidates. Doesn't matter who they are because they're going to do what he tells them to do. And when he needs to turn them over, he simply gets somebody else and puts them in place.
And let me tell you something just really quickly about this new area of political science research. It's called stealth democracy. One of the things that we've discovered is, and this might cause some of you, as I tell my students, some cognitive dissonance, but the reality is that we were never intended to play the role in our democratic process that we play. We had absolutely one job when the Constitution was written, and that was to elect the House of Representatives. Everybody else was selected by somebody else. And the research shows that the more we mess with that system, the more we become involved, the more say we have in it, from primaries all the way up to the election of presidents, the less happy we are with the government that we get. And so I would caution people to look at that literature and look, we have more of a say in who our members of Congress are and who the president is and who we control the primary process. The parties don't control that anymore. And what is our level of trust and satisfaction in government? You know?
So I would distinguish there. I think there's a sliding scale. I think that's more of a problem, frankly, with races further down the ballot where the public is less informed. So the worst example of this is in judicial elections where in big cities nobody knows who they're voting for or what they're voting for.
Retention elections, who knows how to vote?
Right. But it's also true with you run into serious problems with things like, are you better with a appointed school board or an elected school board?
Well,
it depends what the level of public involvement in the educational system is.
Well, and how about profanatories? We elect profanatories? Is that what they are? What's the word?
I don't know.
There are positions that most people, 99% of the people have no idea.
Oh, there are plenty of positions where people have no clue about what
Yeah.
they're,
I don't know
what
what
they're
that
voting
is.
for.
Remember the word.
I don't know how you vote for coroner, quite
Yeah,
honestly.
exactly.
You know,
Or,
I'm still trying to figure that one out.
Recorder of deeds?
But you know, you're right, this is a problem in low information elections, but when parties had a control over who their candidates are, we knew what a candidate stood for.
I would just, I think that's putting a little more rosy gloss on what happened in the past.
I'm not putting a rosy gloss on what happened in the past. What I'm saying is, I've seen the research, and I do it with my students, where you can say, look, these are the issues, right? I have two candidates. I'm not going to tell you who they are, all you know is that one is a Republican and one is a Democrat. Tell me what they stand for. And party labels mean something, they still do today, but they meant even more before. We now have candidates that are running as Democrats who aren't Democrats, Republicans who aren't Republicans. You know, the current president, the Republican Party could have found any way to get rid of him, they would have. And part of the problem is that we are still under the impression that those party labels mean something, and they less and less and less are starting to mean that. they're meaning less more and more over time. And so, yes, low information elections are a problem because you don't know how to vote because there's no party label attached to it, but the opposite end of that problem is if we're only using party labels to make those decisions, well then we're being misinformed. As parties have gotten, away from being able to control their candidate selection process. I don't think that voters shouldn't have a say, but I do think that there's something to be said for parties selecting their own candidates. Because I don't see why Democrats should be able to go over to a Republican primary and sabotage their primary and select a candidate that the Republicans don't want and that party's stuck with it. If you don't like the two major parties, form your own party, but I don't think you should be able to stick them with somebody and then the rest of us think, well, that's what a Republican is. Well, it isn't what it really is.
So do away with primaries?
Do away with open primaries.
I would
is what I'm saying.
I would do away with open primaries.
Quickly
I
on,
would-
quickly on term limits, if you're as old as dirt like Dan Blanco and I are, you remember that at one time in Illinois, the county treasurer and the county sheriff were term limited. And in my county of Stark, next door to you here, when the term limit on the treasurer and sheriff came up, they just exchanged.
That's what's happening in California, where they have term limits. A lot of times it's a musical chair of politics.
A word came up a couple of minutes ago that we haven't touched on, money in politics and lobbyists. Now, talk about the interface of that and how that, obviously it distorts the system, or some would believe it distorts it.
Well, I mean, lobbyists are people who work for special interest groups or corporations or unions, and their job is to try to get that message to them. And look, there's a good side and a bad side to lobbying. As I say to my students, lobbyists aren't aliens that come from another planet. They're mostly, I hope, American citizens. And they provide a way for us to be able to aggregate our views in a way that's important. And it's especially important when you think about groups that don't have money, but have public opinion on their side, or that have some moral issue on their side, like environmental people and the, what we call grassroots lobbying. But what becomes problematic, and what I think people don't realize, is how much lobbyists are influencing government. So, how many people know what ALEC is?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And we know that they got outed recently, and some of the big companies have brought them, but if you don't know, it's the American Legislative Exchange Council. And, this is a conservative group where you've got members of lobbyists and corporations who are sitting down with politicians at the state and national level, and they are writing legislation. And that legislation is then being introduced into the state legislatures and into Congress, and word for word what the lobbyists have written. I didn't elect that lobbyist. I elected you to do the job. And then the other concern that when we think about lobbyists is that the lobbyists that speak the loudest oftentimes are the ones that get heard, and it's not always the same as far as what their support is in the population. So, for example, the National Rifle Association has a disproportionate voice in Congress as a result of how loudly they speak and how they target their resources when you compare to what it is that the average American wants. And I'm not saying no guns versus all guns. What I'm saying is that the average American believes that we ought to have some reasonable policies when it comes to gun control, and that is not at all in line with what the NRA wants. And anytime the issue comes up, the NRA is loud, and that loud wheel gets oiled, and it's because they are well organized and they mobilize their voters and they target people where they know they can target them.
Yeah.
So it's problematic. And one more thing is that members of Congress rely upon lobbyists for information. That's the best source of information is lobbyists, because they have the information ready at their fingertips. But what kind of information is it? It's biased. And that's the problem. So, there's various ways in which lobbyists influence the system, and it's not all just through money, it's part of it, but it's those relationships that are built over time that don't go away even when you term limit somebody out of office.
David?
Yeah, and the problem with lobbying, lobbying is, as you say, has good and bad points. The right to petition the government for redress is one of our rights under the First Amendment. That's a representative government. We all get to express our views to our elected representatives and tell them what we want them to do. So lobbying is not inherently bad. The problem with lobbying, though, is twofold. It corrupts the system in two basic ways. Number one, because people with money can hire lobbyists, people with the richest people get an undue say and an unduly loud voice in the ears of legislators, as opposed to the rest of us, the average people. We don't average voters have many fewer lobbyists, basically, than rich people or rich companies. So it corrupts the system in that way. And you also get this revolving door phenomenon where the legislature simply serves as a farm team for the lobbyist ranks because people can increase their compensation by 10 times by moving from the legislature where they know people and where they form a relationship that they call. And now they go into lobbying, now they can get paid gazillion dollars to go back and try and influence their foreign policy.
I think it's 60% of the people who retire from the U.S. Congress stay in Washington and lobby. In terms of the NRA, it's fascinating. Democracy is messy and it's never going to be perfect. Amanda says loud. I call it intensity. You have intensity of feeling, which ought to be measured or, considered, versus passivity. And so if you're a legislator, you think about your base of voters and what is happening at the margin of your base, not about the 50 or 60% who supported you in the last election. It's how a vote will change the attitudes of 2-3%, meaning 6% total change of people at the margin who will vote for you or against you because of your position on one issue, meaning guns. And so legislators are scared out of their gourds by the NRA, which members will vote for you or against you on that one issue. And so 3 or 4% can, in effect, control the public policy.
It can, and the other thing, just to go on the NRA example, so the other thing the NRA and other lobbying groups do is, it's not just changing the 2 or 3% of people who are single-issue voters, but they also can fund challengers in primaries if you get out of line. And that's their real threat in the current system is, if you don't vote our way, we will fund a challenger who will vote our way in the future. And with respect to the NRA example, the problem again boils down to a poorly informed electorate. People have some ideas in their heads about what guns represent in terms of freedom. The NRA uses those, and the NRA is really driven, if you look at it, it's basically a trade group for gun manufacturers and ammunition manufacturers. They're the ones who provide the real money and define the real positions of the NRA. Then they sell those to their NRA adherents that that's what they should believe, and they buy it. And that's where the NRA's power comes from. But really, it's protecting the interests of gun and ammunition manufacturers, and that's why you have issues on which, if you poll the NRA membership, 70% of them will say that I believe in this. We should have this form of regulation, but the NRA is dead set against it.
Right.
Just very quickly, because I know we've gone over our time, but the issue of big money over here versus people over here has the balance has also been changed because of the decrease in union membership. That used to be an offset.
That was actually a conscious strategy that was adopted beginning with desegregation efforts in the 50s and 60s by basically peoples on the right wing.
Sure.
If you want, there's a great book that just came out.
But that's, you're confirming my point.
Yes,
Yeah, right.
There's a great book that just came out by an academic, a woman professor out of Virginia or North Carolina called Democracy in Chains.
Oh, yeah.
Which talks about the development of this, that whole strategy. But destroying unions was part of it. That's why destroying unions is so central to people like Scott Walker and to some, depending on your point of view.
Snyder in Michigan.
Yes, and other people who've been funded by the Koch brothers and the Mercers, yes.
Let's take, if there's a quick question, one last question.
Yeah, so does that all kind of tie into insider trading in Congress? I know that in 2013 they passed legislation to prohibit it, but they also turned around and passed legislation that made it very hard to track it. And so, and which makes it improbable. And it seems to be a train that will take policy anywhere that's going to the favor into the industry as to what the regulations are going to be against the...
That's a pretty egregious example of self-interest. Clearly, congressmen should not get any special pass about insider trading. they, more than many other people in society, have the ability to trade on inside information because of their involvement in the legislative process. They should be subject to the same rules that everybody else is subject to.
And
not using them.
25,000 of their staff members.
And, right, everybody involved in the government should be subject to the same rules as everybody else with respect to insider trading. I think 90% of the public at least would agree with that, if not 99%.
I hope so.
But Congress has, in that area, over the years, given itself some pretty unsavory exemptions from scrutiny, as you say.
Yeah.
I was chairman of the Illinois Executive Ethics Commission for 4 years, a 4-year term, and we had authority to monitor the executive employees. The legislature created its own ethics commission, which hasn't had an executive director for 2 years now. It's just, we treat ourselves differently.
Let me just say one thing, and it's not directly related to this, but let me just say one last sort of ray of hope for you. There's this belief that members of Congress, that they're just beholden to special interest groups and they will vote the way that they will. And that's true. On issues from which they don't hear from members of their constituencies. Party matters, these special interest groups matter. But when an issue becomes salient amongst the public, and they have enough members of their district contacting them and saying, I want you to do this, I want you to do this, over and over, you can shout down those voices, but you have to be consistent in doing it. I have my own little thing I'm doing right now. Every time there's any kind of mass shooting, and I say that that's more than 4 people, they're saying 10, I say 4, and so that's about 1 a day. And I find out about it, I don't always hear them all. I send a message to my 2 senators and my congressman, and the message just has a little link to the story, and it says, do something. And I do it every day to all 3 of them, and I'm not going to stop doing it until they do something about it. And, I wish more people would do it, because if they hear from us, if our voices are louder, we know that they will be responsive to those voices. History shows that, and the research on Congress shows that they're responsive to
Very
Yeah.
quickly confirm it. When I was a legislator 100 years ago, my seatmate, we didn't have computers, so all the bills were in a huge stack in front of you. My seatmate, a very thoughtful guy, would take letters he received from constituents that were about, I'm for HB 212, and then say why he was for it. He'd put the letters inside the stack next to the legislation, so when the bill came up, he'd pull out the letters. This letter makes a lot of sense. I'm going to vote for that bill or against it. I mean, a few letters can make a big difference.
Let me just expand on that point for a second, because you're absolutely right. If the public gets incensed enough and it's high enough on the radar, you can affect how your representative is going to vote.
Yep.
The problem is legislators handle not 1 or 2 issues, they handle thousands of issues.
Yeah, right.
And where the money really has more corrupting influence, it's not necessarily on the top 1 or 2 issues on abortion or guns or something like that. It's on issues 10 through 20 or 20 through 50, where the public has very little knowledge of what's going on. And on those issues, legislators are told to lean green. And it's cited in Larry Lessig's book. And he said that's advice that some new members of legislatures were given by the pros, and they didn't mean ecological green. But there is hope. We can fix this system. What we want is a system where the legislatures, we don't need to have an outcry, because they will internally decide I have to decide what's actually in the public interest. And notwithstanding all the cynicism about legislatures, there are still a lot of legislators, I would argue the majority of them, still trying to figure out in their own minds what they actually believe is in the public interest. Okay? Now, they have to be politically smart about it to save them, protect their careers. But many of them are motivated by that. What we need is a system where we enable them to go to those better angels, rather than being driven by the money concerns that our present system forces them to respond to. So if we reform this campaign finance system, it makes it easier to deal not only with the corruption issues, but it makes it easier to deal with all the other issues, because right now the campaign finance system makes it harder to deal with every issue, from climate change to guns to abortion to everything else, because it distorts the political process. and does not get the representatives asking themselves at the end of the day, what is truly in the public interest of my constituents in terms of how I should vote one way or another.
And let us, let that serve as our final word tonight. This has been. For an evening that I think has enlightened us all. My head is ready to explode, and I'm sure many others are as well. No, it's been terrific, and thanks to all of you for coming tonight too, and adding your voices to this. Thank you. Safe home.
None of the above.
Well, I have an ex-husband